Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools. We have worked with life science companies for the last 14 years to help them with everything from virtual advisory boards, online medical education, digital investigator meetings. And since the launch of our award-winning Insight Events platform, we've been helping pharma companies with corporate events, MSL and sales rep training, innovation hackathons, and everything in between. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, digital provocateurs, and healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. Well, I'm really excited to having one of these thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Alex Gilbert. He has worked within the digital health industry for several years alongside healthcare, pharmaceutical, and tech organizations. He joined Huma as one of their first employees and currently manages their global life sciences partnerships division. Huma is one of the UK's highest growth digital health companies, and they have raised over $180 million in funding, while still partnering with companies like, brand name companies like Apple, Bayer, Smith & Nephew, and so many, Tencent, many others as well. His passions include the use of technology to empower and engage patients to really help them take control of their own life and their own healthcare. Welcome, Alex. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for the introduction. So glad to be here with you.
Absolutely. So, maybe we can just kind of get started a little. I always like to get to know my guests a little bit, find out a little bit about your career trajectory. You're one of the first employees at Huma. Tell us how you landed where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually initially started doing something completely different. I was very focused on HR and talent. And I was working with pharmaceutical organizations just around the time when digital health or mHealth at the time started to rear its head as an area of interest. And I was super excited about the industry and really saw an opportunity to help a lot of the pharmaceutical and biotech businesses figure out how to hire and set up their first digital health team. So, some of these kind of big pharmaceutical companies would bring me in. I'd figure out what the kind of strategy was, what the plan was for hiring. We'd figure out the first hire, then the first 10. And I then kind of help also kind of manage them throughout that process. Through that, got a really great understanding of the industry and started to connect with different startups with whom I started working on commercial strategy. So given I had all these pharma biotech connections and a vast amount of knowledge on what they were interested in, it gave me a good kind of input then to really help the startups figure out how to commercialize with these businesses. And I came across Huma, or Metapad at the time, who were a very small digital health company in London. I think 6-7 employees at the time, pre-Series A. And Dan, being the pragmatic founder that he is, realized that it was probably cheaper to hire me full time than to pay consulting rates. And so as a result, I ended up joining Huma in a permanent role, which was super exciting because it kind of helped me do both of those things that I was doing previously. So I was both focused on the talent piece and kind of getting us, from that 8 employee level where I joined to around initially 100 employees, and also on the business development piece where I kind of helped us sign our first couple of deals and partnerships within the pharma, biotech, and medtech space. So it was a really, really interesting journey that really let me hone in on both of those skill sets, which is the main reason that I actually decided to join. I thought, a founder that's going to be open-minded enough to let me really create a role that's specific to the things that I need to do and the things that I can do well, that's somebody that I want to work with. And it's obviously gone quite well. We've gone from 8 employees when I've joined to, I think we're nearing or just over 300 now.
Wow.
We've raised a huge amount of money. When I joined, we hadn't raised anything. I think we've now raised over $200 million. And yeah, the people that we're working with and the projects that we're focused on are really incredible. When I think about, the kind of thing that we were talking about back in the day, I think with each year, the ambition and the level of specificity and growth that the business has is growing and changing.
It sounds wonderful. I do want to sort of double click a little bit on the fact that you do come from talent. You come from the human resources area. You helped to start populating, going from 8 to like 300. That's astronomical growth. Mm-hmm. I was just curious, since COVID-19, I just kind of want to think about this a little bit, is a lot of companies have been moving towards digital first, the virtual platforms. have you been contributing to the evolution of the culture at Huma and how employees embrace this? So what has your contribution been based on your background and talent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of twofold. Part of it is definitely just having been one of the people who joined very early on in the business. And with any business like that, you kind of become an integral part of who the business is and how they operate just by virtue of having been there when it started and having contributed to what that culture looks like in the long run. And I've always thought of culture as more of an ever-shifting ocean above a bedrock that sits on values. And so what we look for in the business really as a kind of cursor of whether the culture is moving in the right direction isn't so much the actual culture, but whether the values at the bottom are kind of similar between people. And culture was a thing that's very difficult to kind of understand and manipulate, even during COVID-19. This was kind of post my time really focused on the talent and kind of human resources side of the business, but I still stay involved. But what we could definitely still kind of keep an eye on and still make sure was there were the values that we had, because those don't change, right? The values that you have as an organization and as a team, those are kind of much more firm than the actual culture. And I think with that in mind, we were able to really utilize digital tools and digital methods of communicating while still keeping in mind what those kind of core things that kept us together were. Definitely huge changes in terms of the way in which we interact, definitely in the way in which we kind of socialize with each other as a team. We were always a very, very social team. We kind of really wanted to make sure that we tried to keep that. So we kind of made sure that those interpersonal relationships were really supported and really pushed forward. But overall, I think, we really managed to use it to our advantage. And now we're at a point where as a team, we can do both. We have people who come into the office. We have people who are fully online. We set up the US side of our business, which is fully remote. We have an office in New York, but we have people dotted all around the US, which is something we never would have done previously. It wasn't even a thought process. We were always like, okay, we'll set up in New York and then we'll hire local talent. But this now means that we can hire, incredible people across the entire country instead of having to focus on, okay, the people that live in and around one specific area.
Yeah, absolutely love it. I mean, this is exactly, we're speaking my language. This is what Impetus does. We help pharmaceutical companies connect with customers, payers, physicians from across the globe using our platform. So we completely agree. Let's talk a little bit about Huma and what it is that you do. You've obviously grown exponentially. I'm sure COVID-19 has been a huge accelerant of that growth. You've had probably really used the groundswell of energy behind that. Tell us a little bit about this concept of the hospital at home platform. What is it and how does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Huma was very much initially founded with the idea of connecting patients to physicians outside of the hospital. And the problem that we had in mind was that realistically, when you think about it, patients spend 99% of their time in most cases, in most conditions, outside of the hospital. So what you're missing out on is most of the information and most of the data that's kind of really allowing you to understand how their condition is progressing or how it's occurring, right? You only get that 1% or even less than 1% really of when they're in the clinic live face to face with a clinician. And so we really set out to kind of look at, okay, how can we try and capture as much of that 99% as possible in order to actually augment the way in which we can look at healthcare. And if you think about it, each kind of there have been eras within healthcare, and a lot of them have been tied to the level of insight that we can get, right? Your first physician's notes were found back in ancient Egypt, and they were obviously written down. You then had the advance of things like X-rays, blood tests, kind of various different insights tools. And we think the next insight tool is really going to be down to that digital data piece. And we think it's potentially the most exciting one yet, because for the first time, it's not only novel insight, but it's continuous. All of those things, a genomic analysis, an X-ray, a blood test, they're all episodic. They're a point in time. Now we all carry around these sensors we call phones that are continuously collecting a wealth of digital data about us. And that's really what allows us to set up these hospital at home projects or virtual wards utilizing the Huma platform, which essentially consists of a patient-facing application, a web-based dashboard, which then goes to the clinician and allows them to review all of that information in real time. And then we tailor it to specific conditions. And I think a key part of our success has actually been looking at the whole problem rather than necessarily looking at the problem within a disease indication. We can actually flex and change the platform, and we've created a tool that's flexible enough that we can do that, so that when we approach hospitals and say, hey, let's expand the amount of work that you can do and the way in which you do it. Because it's something that needs to happen with the lack of resource that most hospitals have across the world now. Let's do it in a way where we actually do it as an enterprise level rollout. So instead of just focusing on one condition or one specific situation, let's do it for all of your conditions. Let's actually kind of change the way in which you operate by setting up these hospital at home projects.
Yeah. So, I mean, you said it very nicely, Alex. You really talked about this, ultimately these two core banners at which a lot of people seek medical attention, and that's the episodic care. So things like, unfortunately, like if you got to go for surgery, or, even like COVID-19, I guess could be considered something like that, versus some of the more chronic disease management, like congenital heart disease or diabetes. How do you remain nimble in terms of providing that N=1 or that very customized patient experience while trying to deal with this innumerable number of, episodic versus chronic conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's totally been kind of one of the issues for us as we've grown. We've very consciously taken the decision to not be hyper specific in an indication, which means that we go for breadth, and that's a very difficult thing as a startup to do, right? You get told by everybody that you find your little niche, you focus on that niche, and then you expand after that. Funnily enough, our niche was not having a niche. It was being able to kind of be broad. And the way in which we do it is, we developed and kind of grew a really skilled in-house clinical team who are actually there to kind of help us from a medical standpoint in terms of really understanding the ways in which a lot of these conditions or episodes are managed in different healthcare systems. And that's a very diverse team in terms of kind of geographical background. So they have a good understanding of kind of the different areas in which we operate geographically as well, which is super helpful because different countries will be very different in the way in which they treat certain diseases. And then beyond that, we've actually brought in very skilled partners. So we do not view ourselves as the disease area experts. We are very much the technology company. And then we'll bring in pharmaceutical partners like, for example, Smith & Nephew, with whom we work in orthopedics, or, for example, Bayer, with whom we work in heart failure and kind of other conditions, who will then input to help us really better understand that condition and also help scale the project where we're implementing them. And we also obviously work directly with hospitals, so we'll work directly with key opinion leaders and with hospital staff to actually create solutions that are tailored to them. And the technology behind that enables us to be that flexible and be that nimble is that we built the platform off the back of these things we call modules. Think of those as simplified versions of other digital health apps. It could be a questionnaire, it could be a symptom checker, it could be an exercise of some kind. We use them as Lego blocks to create different versions of the platform. And those are essentially what allow us from a technology standpoint to be super nimble. And then we've built a business really around that technology and that flexibility to ensure that they support each other rather than kind of go against each other.
COVID has brought a very interesting ecosystem to the world. Healthcare has never been more disruptible, and people are jumping in left, right, and center. It also begs the question around the level of noise, distraction, incalculable numbers of certain health apps, wearables, technologies. How do you clear the noise in this environment that we're currently in, where everybody is scurrying for the attention? And what ultimately makes you different than all of these other systems in place right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I've definitely observed in the market is that we've slowly started to see a consolidation of different technologies and different softwares, with more integration and kind of focus on actually providing almost, hopefully at some point, a one-stop shop to the different types of entities that we work with in this industry. And I think that's something that is essential. If you think about it, a hospital is not going to integrate a different app or device or whatever it may be into their hospital system for each different condition that they treat. It takes them, 6 months to a year to do it for one, let alone to do it for everyone. We'd be doing it till the year 3000. And then simultaneously on the life sciences side, they don't want to work with one business for their companion solutions, one for their decentralized studies, one for their registries, and then multiply that by whatever number of conditions they have. They want to be able to work with centralized partnerships. So platforms like ours, where we have that flexibility, and kind of that's really what we've been pushing for, I hope, and kind of I think are really well positioned to actually maximize on that, while simultaneously actually bringing in businesses that do have the specificity that that we lack to actually support the work that we're doing. We integrate a really interesting technology called Happy Tech. They do heart rate variability and heart rate sensing using your PPG sensor, which a few different businesses do. We've integrated that algorithm directly into Huma. We've worked with businesses like Tissue Analytics, who do wound analysis in the past, to actually integrate that algorithm directly into Huma. Because there will be so many amazing technologies that have been developed for specific indications. It's just that when you apply it to a conglomerate, that's not the only problem that they want to solve. They want to look at kind of other things. So I think there's definitely a shift now in the market. The other reality is that health tech is in a bubble. We've got probably, I would say, anywhere between 3 and 5 years before that bubble bursts, in the same way that every tech industry like ours, like green tech or the .com era, all went through a bubble and then burst. And the hope is that, kind of certain organizations can escape the bubble and then work with other businesses to actually consolidate the market and kind of have a very focused value stream.
It sounds like really ultimately everybody's seeking to be or to become that super app, not trying to compare anything to Facebook's, but or the Googles, but they're or what's called meta now, but becoming that centralized platform at which all people are joining, and then you become that centralized app. And I guess ultimately the question comes down to interoperability, privacy, security systems. How are you going about solving some of these big, huge issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think health tech is very different to any other kind of technology industry. Just because healthcare is very different to any other industry. We're dealing with the most sensitive kind of data. It's not like, your shopping history or something like those lines. This is health data. And that means that it's sacred to everyone, in the ways in which it can be used, in the ways in which it can be changed or, kind of adapted to different use cases. So for us, the focus has always been very much on how can we augment patient care and how can we kind of improve research into care, without necessarily having the idea of, okay, we're a data company in the long run and how are we going to use that? Because we realize that this is a very consumer focused industry ultimately, and we want to make sure that the patient is really at the center of everything that we do and an improvement in outcomes for them, even when it goes kind of against business performance. So with that in mind, that's influenced a lot of the decisions that we make as a business, both in terms of kind of safety and the projects that we take on and how we work on those projects. And I think that's allowed us to set ourselves up in a way where hopefully, 5 to 10 years from now, when and if we're one of those businesses that has escaped the bubble, we're in a place where we're not kind of working towards people's disadvantage, but actually kind of supporting them in a way that makes sense. And that's changing, the way and improving the way in which they receive care. Beyond that, I think it was always very important to us. And again, this is an industry I think that has high barriers to entry once you actually understand it. We've on a really great regulatory team who, has set us up as a medical device and helps us really kind of stay abreast of changes globally. We have a really great data security team in place who, we've kind of picked and choose from both the life sciences, healthcare, and tech industries who are kind of helping us kind of manage that. So I think we're really set up to scale in that regard. And I think what makes us different is we've been doing this for 10 years now. The business has existed for 10 years. Actually, we founded in 2011. And that gives us a level of kind of experience that a lot of organizations don't have to understand that this is a point in time in the history of digital health, rather than necessarily, the past 5 years have been the digital health industry. Things will continue to change and evolve and adapt. And it's businesses that can simultaneously be scalable and adaptable that are going to survive that kind of shift and movement as the industry changes over time, as it did with COVID, right? None of us could have predicted that COVID was going to happen. The businesses that could adapt quickly through COVID and provide solutions were the businesses that scaled. We had, when COVID hit, we had, I think, one project with the German Ministry of Health that went live within 6 weeks of a first conversation. That's a ridiculous amount of speed. And because we were that adaptable and we could move that quickly, that allowed us to then benefit from the scalability that it allowed us to have.
COVID really turned clinical trials on its head. I remember distinctly hearing about that moratorium that happened on a lot of clinical trials. It just stopped abruptly. And as you can know, that's like the main, like that's the blood center for companies, their survival, their innovation hubs. And so the whole world around decentralized trials came up, and all of the discussion around, ECOAs, EPROs, connected devices, on and on it goes. Tell us about what Huma did to intervene there, and what this new world of decentralized trials will look like moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as you said, COVID really changed everything. It made everybody, because it made everybody think differently. It made everybody think about digital health not so much as a nice to do, but as a necessity, which is what always needed to happen for this industry to thrive. And that worked across both kind of the healthcare side of things, where you needed that remote connection to the patient, and then also on the research side of things, where again you needed that remote connection to the patient. It wasn't safe to collect information live anymore. And so, we were quite well positioned actually to start doing that. We had a project with Stanford and Bayer. That was our first kind of decentralized study, where the actual project was to evaluate what a decentralized trial looked like and how it could work. And we ended up launching that, kind of just, I think, at the start of the pandemic, and actually gained a lot of insight and experience for that. And then our second project was actually a phase 4 study for one of the vaccines, which was definitely a trial, or kind of baptism by fire, as our first project, kind of launching in, I think, most major markets across the world. But it really helped us to kind of both learn with a partner that really understood what they needed from this space, with us enabling the technology side of things. And we realized that in its essence, it's very similar / the same as what we've been doing in remote patient monitoring or patient companions, with some slight tweaks and differences to allow for the way in which data is managed, because you have to submit that information to a regulatory body. Difference in the way in which you collect consent. We do consent now for actual trial participation, because why would you bring a patient in person to consent for a study when you can do it online? And we've seen some really interesting things pop up around that. The Stanford Bayer study, we were doing social media recruitment. They were recruiting via social media. They would then get e-consented via the tool, and they'd be tracked for, I think it was 6 months, without a single in-person visit. So not one single in-person visit with a physician. Obviously, most trials now are thinking about more of a mixed approach rather than necessarily kind of just one or the other. But we've definitely seen a lot of leaders within this clinical space actually start to think of this as, hey, I can collect more information. I don't have to have as many of these expensive in-person visits. I can have the team kind of focused on engaging and empowering patients so that they continue participation in the trial, rather than just, in-person visits where I'm getting the same data that I could probably get from a patient at home.
So you've actually painted this story very well as we start to really delve in as governments and society at looking at the escalating costs of healthcare, and the fact that it's probably not going to be sustainable. So looking at these interventions that are sort of creeping up around us, including Huma and other platforms, to start looking at the way we're doing things, the way we're doing clinical trials. But it does beg the questions also about just general diagnosis. We have kind of socialized our system to really come from a sickness care model to trying to evolve to more of a wellness. So a precluding, an understanding of your current, sort of standard way that your body functions. And if something kind of goes haywire for you as an N=1, we can diagnose that and help and intervene. So I was curious if you could speak a little bit about Huma and the philosophy around things like digital biomarkers and even this idea of digital phenotyping. How are you going to utilize an individual's phone as being a sensor for their particular lifestyle?
Yeah, absolutely. And really it goes back to what I was saying around the level of insight changing, and the types of insights that we can generate changing due to the fact that we now carry around sensors of various kinds with ourselves every day. And, I always thought that digital biomarkers were going to be the thing that pushed digital health into the collective zeitgeist. Turns out it was COVID, which again, couldn't have predicted that. But I think that this level of insight that's now allowing people to actually have assessments in the palm of their hand, whether it's being able to check their AFib using their smartphone camera, whether it's, we have a digital biomarker that we worked on with Janssen that allows you to do a word recall test on your phone, and kind of looks at voice analysis to assess or diagnose Alzheimer's disease, which is going through kind of clinical validation at the moment. So these tools are now becoming kind of really something that the patient can hold in the palm of their hand, and they're validated as kind of medical devices. These are not kind of just these are not kind of easy consumer technologies. They're truly kind of an a medical insight tool. And I think it's super essential because the way in which we do healthcare needs to change. As I was saying, we have a shortage of resource everywhere, really. And as a result, we really need to kind of think about, okay, what is the role of the physician and the clinical team in terms of managing patient care? And if you think about it, a lot of the times what physicians are doing is they're collecting data, and then they're kind of actually taking in that data and trying to make calculations and kind of assess things so that they can then input on what the patient's care should be. Realistically, the latter part is the only thing that they should be doing. Why should we have our physicians, who are highly skilled individuals, be there to collect information and analyze it? That can and should be done by something that is an automated program, because it's less subjective, it's immediate, and it also allows them to focus on what they really do best, which is give advice and decide on what the direction of travel should be, which is where I think their role is going to end up, and something that I don't think that technology can do. It's very different, having a human being actually look at, okay, your PPG sensor is saying this is saying this is saying that. With that in mind, this is the best treatment course for you, given your age demographic, et cetera, et cetera. So actually putting back that level of decision making as the core part of their role, rather than necessarily data generation, which can be done utilizing technology. And I think that's ultimately what's going to hopefully lead us also to having a much more proactive rather than reactive care environment. It's very different. A lot of people will wait to go to their physician, or will wait until something's wrong, or that's the way that we've been taught to work with our healthcare systems. Because we have a resource shortage, it's really rare that people have kind of just continuous checkups on their health anymore, right? You only really do it when something goes wrong. Whereas now we're getting to a point where you can do that from the comfort of your own home with a mobile device in your hand. Who's to say that, 10, 20 years from now, you're not able to do a full medical checkup with, one app or one solution in your home that just does everything for you. And then you can identify things a lot earlier, because that barrier to actually accessing care, or something that's as close to care as possible from a tech perspective, is gone. It's immediately there. So yeah, I think that move from proactive to reactive care, and actually the augmenting of the physician's role, are both things that are ultimately going to be the most impacted by this use of digital biomarkers and the advance of digital phenotyping.
In the life sciences space, we have routinely always thought of innovation more or less in some sort of a chemical entity creation, or nowadays a biologic or a small molecule, that it's some kind of an entity that's more biological. Now we're starting to think about machines, and we're thinking about sensors, and we're thinking about software. And we hear about this term of software as a medical device. Do you see the day where physicians are going to go to a digital pharmacy and actually dispense a software app like Huma as something to actually treat a condition? What do you think about that future?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, I think we're more or less already there. I see that different countries around the world already have kind of services like that, where there is kind of this, something that's very similar to an online dispensary, where people can kind of get apps prescribed to them. And I see it probably most advanced when we're talking about digital medicine, or digital therapeutics and digital biomarkers. Digital therapeutics, where it's a very cut and clear similar development and really commercialization process as you would with a molecule, right? That's why the digital therapeutics. And I very much see those operating as they do currently on a prescription and subscription type model. Similarly, the digital biomarker space, again, very similar to the way in which you would do any kind of diagnostic technology, easy to prescribe and provide. I do think that most physicians now are kind of looking at these technologies as something that they can prescribe, especially if they kind of have access to them. But I hope that what we get to is actually a point where, and this is, I think, more or less the holy grail in digital health, where people are continuously using technology to track their health, and then we'll have that system or solution change over time as certain things change or occur around them. So hopefully, that actual prescription tool is something that you just carry with you at all times. It's tracking your health day to day. It's your kind of, it's your continuous health manager. And then or kind of a physician can prescribe things via that technology that will then maybe change things as certain situations arise. Because that's really when we're going to get the highest level of engagement. And hopefully, when we're going to reach that real ability to enable proactive care.
Absolutely. I'm also wondering about how the world of reimbursement and regulatory approvals is going to change in the future, especially as we think about software and platforms like this intervening or being combined with typical chemical entities or biologics. And the question really of how are we going to do clinical trials? How are we going to ascertain endpoints? How are we going to determine efficacy and safety, quality of life, all of these things that end up going to public or private payers then reimburse the actual, user or healthcare consumer. How do you see this sort of changing when we start thinking about real world evidence and the N=1 interceptivity of your own personal data? What do you think this is going to look like in the future?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of change in the space. I think that certainly from a regulatory perspective, real world evidence is becoming far more valuable than we previously saw it. I mean, one of the kind of examples that I like to think about a lot is the Pfizer breast cancer drug approval that kind of initially started as a drug for female breast cancer and was then had its indication expanded to also cover male breast cancer as a result of real world data from off-label prescriptions. And the FDA kind of actually taking that on as kind of information that was then allowed to, expand that indication. Really useful because there's not a lot of research that goes into male breast cancer. And as a result, there are not a lot of drugs on the market because it's a small portion of the market. So solutions like this can actually help to target or kind of improve the kind of access that people with certain conditions can have to new and novel treatments. And I think the real world evidence piece will also augment and change the way in which people can derive value from certain drugs. It could either extend the lifespan of a specific treatment, or as that it can expand the indication, or it can even allow you to tailor the disease further, find novel information. I think all of that is already and kind of will continue to change. And I think the regulatory market is slowly starting to take notice of that. In all honesty, I would say the FDA is probably the most advanced, both in terms of understanding the implications of data as well as software into how they operate and how they see the future. You guys and the FDA were really the first to, I think, understand digital therapeutics and how they could potentially be taken through a regulatory pathway. In Europe, with kind of the regulatory methodologies that we have, we kind of are following, I think, the US at this stage. And because there's so much diversity in terms of the countries, and same for APAC, right? There's no kind of centralized way of working. But I think those things are changing. And I think, as with any kind of regulatory operating system, it's going to take longer than the actual industry to change. They adapt to us, we don't adapt to them. But I'm seeing a lot of really positive open-mindedness. And actually, I think although a lot of digital health businesses will complain that reg is too tough, I actually think that it's a lack of clarity rather than necessarily that these systems are too difficult to work with. Actually, all of the regulators that we've worked with have been very open-minded and, very kind of pragmatic when they think about technologies and tools like ours and change to the industry and how it's going to affect them. And they want to work with technology, things like value-based care, et cetera, are coming up as positive traits and positive influences for them in the future. It's more so that it's a lack of clarity. The regulators more often than not don't really know what to do with this tech. And the worst thing for businesses that are small is that you don't have a clear regulatory pathway, because then you have to invest a lot more time and effort in actually figuring out what you're supposed to do rather than just following, a script.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting questions. In fact, one of the things around built-in machine learning or smart algorithms is that the regulatory approval of the software as a medical device on day one may not be the same algorithm, 3 years later. So there's going to be a lot of interesting questions as it relates to, the regulatory environment. On this note, there was a question from the audience here really around the concern about AI in general. I think there's a lot of concerns about things even just intrinsically built in, like bias, people's usage or access to digital, but also the concern about people in general. I know that we've all heard about the Great Reset, or what other people are calling the Great Resignation. There just seems to be a general lack of supply of good, accessible individuals for all kinds of jobs, including healthcare. And it does sort of beg the question, is AI going to be a replacement for the people that we've got used to? I know you spoke a little bit about the fact that you don't necessarily see this as a redundancy, but is there something to be said about the potential shortage or the future shortage, and where some of these smoke, I guess eventually smart robots, whatever, walking chatbots, smart digital is going to take over, and then we only use real human beings for interpersonal types of relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. I think especially a couple of years ago, there were a lot of digital health companies that were promising replacing the doctor. And I don't think personally that that's the right approach. I think that a physician is something that is essential, not only from the perspective of managing an interpersonal relationship. I think we tend to oversimplify the role of the physician when we see them as kind of the personal touch to whatever technology may do. But actually, the ability to make a much more nuanced decision than a technology platform can make. Technology platform is going to come up with the most logical decision based off of the data. And the reality is that healthcare sometimes isn't as logical as that. And I don't think we're going to be at a point where we can actually make the most logical decision, the most impactful one, for a very long time. It's kind of like how, you can teach an AI to recognize a cat in an image, and you can kind of teach it over a long period of time to kind of take any kind of image and recognize a cat. But then you'll ask it to recognize a dog tomorrow, and it won't have any idea what it's doing. People have the ability to maybe make less quick decisions, but make much more nuanced decisions because of the way in which our brains operate and work. And I think because of that, the role of the physician will always be one that is there to be the decision maker and the kind of guidance counselor in terms of, okay, these are the options and these are how they're going to impact you, taking into account your way of life, taking into account what your goals are, taking into account your emotional state, so many different things that I think an AI is going to struggle to understand. What an AI can do is it can give us the highest level of insight possible. So it can tell you, okay, this is what all of the data combined in different ways, once you crunch the numbers, once you look at kind of all of these different data points coming from the patient, these are the high level insights that then a physician can look at and say, okay, this is the decision that we make. And I think that augmenting of the physician role is really essential to our health systems, because the rate of physician to population is just going to get smaller and smaller, unfortunately. Maybe that changes. Maybe again I'm wrong. Maybe COVID is going to force the next generation to all go to med school. That would certainly be a great outcome. But I think current trends showcase that that ability to cater to a population is just going to get smaller and smaller over time.
We oftentimes think about blockchain in terms of fintech. We think about that in the financial industry. Blockchain is always associated, or normally associated, with tabulations and transactions. We don't oftentimes associate blockchain with the healthcare space. So I do want to pose the question to you. In this new world that we're all navigating through, we're hearing a lot about blockchain, but more in terms of cryptocurrencies and Dogecoins and all these other things, NFTs. I was just curious about the longer term focus on where you think blockchain is going to work, especially with apps and platforms like Huma, around data security, privacy, and more importantly, access and ownership. As people start to navigate the concerns, we hear this all the time about cybersecurity, but we also hear about people's concerns about owning their data, ownership, and potentially even monetizing it. Where do you sort of see this playing out? And where do you think Huma might fit into this overall equation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think blockchain is a super interesting technology. I think it's most applicable within that field of kind of health record management and individual health record management, and the way in which we, kind of store that information. And yes, I think will lead to a point where ultimately individuals not only own their own data, but have full control of that information, which is exactly where we should be headed for any kind of data, really. And health data is, just a small part of that. I think one of the things that I've certainly noticed over the years that I've been in digital health is that we kind of like to take on whatever the kind of nouveau technology is. and everybody talks about it for kind of 6 to 12 months, and everybody says that they do it. And the reality is that everybody was doing what they were previously doing. And these are just kind of little tools and augmentations that will change the way in which maybe, certain things operate. But it's kind of like, adding a tool to your tool belt rather than replacing the whole tool belt. I think for us, it's still early from a blockchain perspective, definitely for Huma. I think, that as the business changes over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and as that technology becomes more stable and more accessible, it's definitely something that I can see us incorporating. But I don't think that we're fully there yet. Although I'm really excited to see how some of the EMR providers start looking at blockchain, especially, as it relates to that kind of health data storage and management. I'm sure that it'll ultimately take, disruptive small businesses that are focused on that space to actually get acquired or partner with these businesses to see that change happening in 9 to 10 years. But, the difficult thing about health tech is that it takes us a lot longer to change and adapt to technologies because we're tied to an industry that takes a lot longer to adapt and change to technologies. You think about fintech moves super quickly, right? You can be high risk, you can change things, you can adapt things. Why not? It's, mobile banking came out of nowhere and it was suddenly the thing and it changed everything. Mobile healthcare management is still, a question mark and something that's still growing and changing. So I think that other industries will move forward quicker, but because of the way in which healthcare works, because of, the fact that it's regulated, because it has to be much safer, we can't take those risks. It takes a longer time to see that change. But I am very excited to see where a lot of things related to Web3 relate to the way in which we do health tech. It's, who knows, maybe at some point you'll be able to do your patient visit in the metaverse, and you'll be able to use all these digital biomarkers to have a completely virtual visit. So who knows? We'll see where these things will adapt. But I think blockchain is super interesting technology, especially as it relates to obviously that health data storage and management.
I know there's a very bizarre part of me that just wonders in this ideal world with, ambient biometrics and just the sensors of all around us. Eventually it'll be the new UBI, or universal basic income, that will be kryptonized or will tokenize everything that just flows, and people build those on innovation, and it's all encrypted. So it's not individual data, but that might be the way we make a living in the future. It'll be the new gamification that we keep talking about. So instead of actually gaming in the metaverse, it's just living your life. But we shall see. So interesting.
Well, that's the best game ever, right? Living your life.
I know, I guess the conspiracy theory that we all just are living in a simulator anyway, but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
So this was a fascinating discussion. For anybody who's interested in speaking with Alex, finding out more about Huma, or even looking for ways to partner, they do a ton of work with healthcare organizations, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, medical device. Please look for his contact details in the show notes below. He would love to speak with you. If you're also interested, check out impetusdigital.com. We actually work with payers, physicians, allied healthcare providers, sponsors, people working on clinical trials, coming up with innovations, how to actually start inserting interesting apps and platforms like Huma into the pharmaceutical companies. We'd love to actually check it out. We work with people in an asynchronous and synchronous way, and we'll actually do that over time. So check that out as well. Please like and subscribe to our channel. We would love if you can leave some feedback as well on iTunes. And we want to thank everybody for their time today. And thank you, Alex, for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much, Natalie. What a pleasure speaking with you. I hope you have an incredible day. And thank you for the eye-opening conversation that we've just had.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.